You hear the wind first, thin, cold, needling through stone. Your breath ghosts in the air. Candlelight stutters. Ahead of you, a girl no taller than your shoulder bites the rim of a wool blanket and swallows a scream. She is 13. The room does not care. Margaret grips a wooden rosary until the beads print moons into her palm. Snow clings to the arrow slits. Outside, banners of red and white roses snap like teeth. Inside, the world narrows to heat and pain, to the weight of a child demanded by men who speak entreaties and move lives like chessmen. She inhales salt, tallow, iron, and holds the breath as if it were a door she can brace with her small body. If you want the parts of history that textbooks soften or skip, subscribe to Dark History, then stay in this room with her. The midwife murmurs prayers. The priest answers with a low Amen, and the wind threads their voices together. Margaret's crucifix quivers at her throat, a metronome of fear and defiance. They say destiny is mercy. Tonight, it is a blade, consummation signed into law, childhood turned to collateral, a womb made into a border where two kingdoms bargain. Another contraction seizes her. The roses outside are only cloth. The snow will melt, but the child they force from this icy chamber will not melt. He will be named Henry. He will be asked to end a war and mend a country, and the girl who bears him will never be a child again. Snow powders the sill of the nursery window. It melts where it touches the warmth of Margaret's fingers. She traces the fog her breath makes on the glass, then folds her hands around the wooden cross that never leaves her palm. The beads click softly, counting, measuring, disciplining a child into the shape of a lady. Servants whisper that her blood is old and bright, a thread woven back to John of Gaunt and further into a tapestry she cannot yet read. To Margaret, lineage is not a triumph, but a weight. A crown pressed on the skull before the skull has hardened. A clerk unrolls a parchment before her like a battle map. Inked lines climb from ancestor to ancestor, branching like black winter trees. Names glitter in scarlet initials. Small roses margin the vellum. He taps at a junction and tells her, again, how legitimate can sit beside forbidden in the same sentence, how blessed blood can carry a curse. The words are careful. The meaning is not. Margaret feels the cross grow heavier. Jesu miserere, she writes in a cramped hand that tries to look grown. If I was born into a promise, show me what it must cost. Do not let me be proud of what I did not earn. The house is quiet in the ways of noble houses, quiet like a held breath. Tutors come and go, teaching Latin prayers and the art of listening without speaking. Margaret learns to keep her back straight when men discuss money and men titles and treaties. She watches their hands more than their mouths. The way a ring turns on a thumb can mean a debt unpaid. The way a quill hovers can mean a life rearranged. Somewhere between lessons on saints and heraldry, she studies a different catechism. Who hates whom? Who owes whom? Who bleeds? In the world beyond the nursery, banners multiply and tempers thin. The red rose gathers lawyers and lords. The white rose hoards grievances and steel. There will be counsels, accusations, attainders. There will be a reckoning for old slights and new mistakes. This is the part a chronicler might write in tidy lines, but a child feels it as weather, pressure dropping, windows rattling, doors barred at dusk. Margaret kneels on rushes and presses her brow to the cross. The wood smells of oil and human heat. She thinks of her father's absences described as duties, of his silences described as prudence, of his end wrapped in words adults do not explain. A chessboard sits in the solar, its ivory pawns arranged for a game no one finishes. She has been taught how each piece moves. She has not been told which piece she is. Mother of mercy, she scratches later in a little book, make me useful, or make me small enough to go unseen. Do not make me both. Snow returns in the night, a soft erasure over tracks to the gate. At breakfast, a messenger arrives, blown white with frost, a seal bright as a wound on the letter he carries. Men gather, the quill hovers, a ring turns on a thumb. Margaret's cross quivers where it hangs against her skin, and for the first time she understands the board is already set. Only the move is missing. Who will reach for her square? The betrothal is ink before it is breath. A neat column of names, a dowry like a measure of grain, seals pressed into wax that smells faintly of honey and heat. In the solar, Margaret stands beside the chessboard while men speak of fortunes and futures. John de la Pole, Suffolk's boy, has courteous eyes, a velvet cap, and a tutor who answers for him. They are both children arranged to look like answers. The rings glint, the quill moves, the roses on the margins of the parchment look freshly cut. If I am to be given, let me be given wisely, she writes later, the line kept small so as not to offend the page. Teach me to bend without breaking. Teach me where to hide my own name. The house learns to pronounce Suffolk the way one says shelter in winter. He is the king's great favorite. He turns the key of patronage. His shadow promises warmth. Margaret watches the adults relax around that shadow as if a fireplace has been stoked. Tutors change. Visitors linger. Talk lifts when the letters from court arrive. She touches the cross at her throat and practices the posture of agreement. On the chessboard, a pawn advances, a rook shifts to cover. The board looks steadier than it feels. But weather turns even inside stone walls. Rumor travels faster than horses. First a whisper, indictments, enemies, a commons that will not be soothed. Then an edict, banishment. Then, abruptly, the channel. The story comes in pieces, like flotsam, until the shape is too clear to look at for long. A small ship edging out into cold water, another vessel intercepting, a verdict executed without judge or altar. The sea keeps its own court, blade on wood, bodies and salt. In the morning, Suffolk washes ashore headless, a nobleman remade into a warning. The wax on Margaret's contract softens in the heat of the day and sets again at night, but the words beneath it curl like leaves under frost. The alliance is now a risk, then an embarrassment, then a past tense. Adults adjust their sentences with courtly adverbs, regrettably, prudently, in light of new circumstances, until the betrothal becomes what paper always can become, ash if you hold it too near the fire. The household's voice lowers. The chessboard is reset without anyone admitting they touched it. Margaret studies the lesson the way she studies Latin. Adaptation has a grammar. Silence is a conjugation. You can decline yourself into safety. She memorizes names not only for kinship, but for winds. Who is rising? Who is falling? Where the draft sneaks in around the door. Snow returns, tidy on the leads. In the chapel, her cross knocks once against her sternum when she kneels, as if reminding her to keep time with a metronome that is not her own. Lord, keep my mind sharp and my mouth closed. She scratches in the margin of a psalter. If I must move, let it be, because I chose it. If I cannot choose, let me see the board first. News from Westminster comes dry as parchment. Factions harden, favors are recalculated, and the king's household leans toward blood that is safer to praise. Somewhere within those sentences, two names keep repeating, Edmund and Jasper, men whose nearness to the crown is not by birth alone, but by the private arithmetic of queens. The roses at the edge of the page seem to lift in a wind. A messenger rides, a new seal breaks, and the square that once held Suffolk's son now opens like a mouth, waiting to say her future out loud. The new seal breaks with a brittle sigh. Edmund's name sits high on the page, Earl by patent, tutor by a queen's long shadow, a man whose nearness to the crown is measured not only in blood, but in expectation. Arrangements tighten like laces. The household moves with the smoothness of habit. A dowry tallied, witnesses named, a priest engaged. A date chosen that looks tidy on parchment even if it feels abrupt in the chest. They meet beneath painted saints. Edmund is careful, court-bred, composed like a line of script. He speaks to her as one speaks to a responsibility. Margaret keeps her back straight, her cross steady against her sternum. The small roses sewn along her sleeves prickle as if their threads remember thorns. On the chessboard in the solar, someone has advanced a pawn 2 squares and left it there, exposed and obedient. The vows are brief, the blessings longer. Latin rises and falls like a tide. Gold circles a finger that has not yet stopped growing. Men nod, women murmur. The seal is pressed. Outside, the season tilts toward harvest. Inside, time hardens into permanence. A chronicler would note the hour and the titles. A child notes the weight of the ring and how it makes the skin beneath it ache. Lord, if this is your will, make me strong enough to bear it, she writes later in a thin, slanted hand. And if it is man's will, remember me. Custom has a clock, and it does not pause for bone and sinew. The bedding is expected. Proof is expected. Doors close. Voices fall away. What happens is not a story told in detail, but a ritual measured by witnesses and by the silence that follows it. Margaret learns that duty can be louder than pain and quieter than pity. In the morning, the house behaves as houses do when contracts are complete. There is linen to wash and news to carry. She is congratulated with the same words courtiers use for treaties. A month lengthens into a rumor within her body, then into certainty. The midwife's eyes are kind and grave at once. Margaret is very young in a way that makes even the devout flinch. The ledger of risks comes open, pelvis still narrow, labor unpredictable, the church's litany familiar with the words mater and mortal. Edmund speaks of heirs and the future. The council's letters speak of storms on the horizon. Margaret speaks less and prays more, fingers counting the rosary as if it were a rope she could climb hand over hand out of a pit. Holy Mother, keep the child safe. If only one life can be carried through, take mine first. She scratches in the margin of a psalter, then blots the ink before it spreads. Days begin to sort themselves into two kinds. Those in which the world outside presses in, the roses red and white collecting grievances and men, and those in which the child within presses outward, announcing himself with small tidal motions. At table, Edmund's news is paved with names. Warwick moves, the king hesitates, loyalties cool and ignite. In chapel, Margaret's news is wordless and absolute. The cross at her throat taps lightly with each breath, a metronome that refuses to let her forget what has been placed inside her as both promise and demand. Autumn leans into winter, the air sharpens, windows sweat and then frost. Christmas candles gutter in drafts that find every crack in the stone. Somewhere to the west rises a castle with thick walls and a hall that holds the wind differently, a place of safety, if safety can be said of stone. Letters begin to mention it more often, Pembroke. And even as Margaret learns to balance on the narrow ledge between obedience and endurance, the road there is already being swept by snow. The letter rides in on cold hooves, seals, signatures, the usual theater, except for the line that does not belong to theater at all. Edmund taken at Carmarthen, fever in the jail. The sentences are arranged to bruise gently, but bruise they do. Margaret holds the page without feeling the page. The cross at her throat is suddenly too heavy for its chain. Days narrow to messengers, to the weight of footsteps in corridors. Then the word that ends the waiting ends other things too. Gone. No priest beside him, no ritual except the rough liturgy of breath leaving the body. A scribe will later find a way to call it providence or plague. Margaret learns a different vocabulary, one in which widowhood is both a garment and a verdict, and 13 is not an age, but a direction in which other people push you. Jasper comes with the competence of winter, quietly, necessarily, without waste. He does not ask whether she can travel. He counts the hours until she must. Pembroke is safer. Pembroke is stone that keeps the wind at a distance most of the time. Pembroke is a name adults say. Like a door, they can bolt behind them. Margaret nods and lets the decision land inside her like a settled bird. The child moves. The world moves. She moves. The journey begins under a sky the color of tin. Snow chews at the edges of the road, then at its middle. Men ride ahead to find fords, to gauge the temperament of bridges. The roses that used to border parchment now border fields, ragged hips on thorn, winter's reminder that beauty stays sharp when it must. Margaret rides cloaked and rigid, one hand on the pommel, the other around the beads. Each jolt of the horse measures a different fear. The landscape is all muscle and stone, terse as a soldier. Holy Mother, keep me on the road you have chosen, she whispers into her palm, where the cross lies warm from her skin. If I must arrive smaller, let me arrive unbroken. At inns, the talk is fox-thin and quick. Who sits easy with the king, who writes letters with both hands, one to Lancaster, one to York. Jasper listens and spends his silence like coin. Margaret eats broth because broth is what comes when there is nothing else to ask for. At night, she dreams of a chessboard gone to frost, pawns half buried, a rook tipped on its side, the king's square empty as a tooth, pulled clean. Pembroke rises from the whiteness like a command. Thick walls that learned their lessons centuries ago. A hall that holds light in careful portions. Smells, smoke, old ale, wet wool. Jasper's men turn to their winter habits. A priest finds his chapel. A midwife finds the room that will be needed and speaks in a voice that belongs to rooms like that. The midwife's hands are clean and capable. Her eyes count margins, the bone width, the angle of the hips, the calendar's stubborn arithmetic. Omniscience would say, the odds are poor. Margaret understands this without numbers. She does not ask the question that would require anyone to lie. She walks the hall in steady lines to teach her legs how to remember steadiness. In chapel, wax drips into small domes that cool and harden. The child rolls once under her ribs like a seal turning under black water. Snow stacks on the battlements. Wind plays scales in the arrow slits. Somewhere below, Jasper counts provisions and men. Somewhere beyond, roses sharpen into metal again. In the room set aside for her, the bed looks less like furniture and more like a border drawn by other hands. Margaret kneels, presses her forehead to the wood of the cross, and listens to the house breathing around her, the deep, indifferent respiration of stone. When the pain begins, it does not announce itself with drama. It chooses a point and returns to it, patient as a clerk, insistent as a bell. The midwife lifts her eyes. The priest lifts his book. The wind lifts and drops, lifts and drops. The door closes softly, and the world becomes one room wide. Pain chooses its point and returns like tide. At first, it is only a tightening, a circle drawn small under the navel. The midwife lays out cloth and thread, oil and herbs that smell of bitter green. A brazier ticks. Snow slides off a slate roof somewhere and thuds like a muffled drum. Margaret breathes in counts that the rosary has taught her. Bead, 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 release. Cannon hours mark what no clock dares. Matins shivers in the chapel while the room is still a negotiation. Lauds arrives, and the negotiation turns to siege. She stands, then kneels, then grips the bedpost. The grain carves itself into her palm like script. Voices keep themselves small. The priest's Latin, the low arithmetic of women, measuring time between moans. Margaret's crucifix flutters against her throat, a small pendulum helpless to slow anything. By prime, sweat webs her hairline. The midwife's hands are the only weather allowed near her, warm, brisk, unafraid. Breathe, they say without saying it. Jasper's boots pass the door once, then not again. Outside the chapel, the bell swallows its own echo. Terse brings knives to the edges of vision. No blades yet, only the thought of them, as if steel could be smelled before it is seen. The child does not ride straight. He presses in a way that sets murmurs moving from one woman's mouth to another's eyes. Margaret hears none of the words, only their shape. Her world narrows to linen, to heat shimmering off the brazier, to the slow, deep pull of a body asked to be more doorway than shelter. Sexed scalds. She bites the blanket and tastes tallow and salt. The windows weep. The fire hisses. The room expands and contracts with her like a lung. The midwife directs, steadies, revises. A stool is brought, then dismissed. Oil warms on a spoon. Shadows lengthen. The chessboard in the solar is somewhere beyond stone and corridor, but the game plays here. A pawn pressed toward a far rank no one promised it would live to reach. None slides toward vespers. A decision ripens between the women without ripening out loud. Hands that have done this 100 times do it again, and yet each time is a first and a last. The midwife's glance tells the priest what not to pray. Margaret bears down and finds just at the edge of her vision a white rose pinned at a bodice. The sight of it brings heat into the cold and her anger into a single useful line of force. Then, silence. The room hears itself. Linen whispers. A last turning like a key in a hard lock. The world pauses on the width of a blade. The cry arrives thin and astonished, and the women let go of the air they were holding. A small purple creature, slick with the work of being born, shudders in new light. He opens his mouth and argues with winter. Somewhere vespers rolls like distant surf. "Henry," someone says, and the name seems older than the child. Margaret does not reach for him at once because the midwife's hands are still busy with her, with blood that does not know when to be done, with flesh that has been asked to do more than it was built to do. Their faces change, their voices do not. Stitch, salve, pressure, prayer. Night fits itself to the castle. The baby sleeps a stranger's sleep. Margaret lies very still, counting beads without moving her hand, the cross cool again at last. She understands something that needs no words. The line has been saved, and something else has broken to pay for it. In the corridor, a bell taps once, then is quiet, as if the house itself is asking the question no one will speak. What will this victory cost tomorrow? Morning doesn't so much arrive as thin out, ash gray seeping through the shutters, a light that exposes more than it warms. Margaret keeps still and lets her breath climb the rosary, bead by careful bead. The midwife has finished her quiet arithmetic. The judgment is universal. Flesh torn, bone overreached, a doorway forced too wide, too early. They speak in the tone people use at thresholds, gentle, practiced, almost bright, and inside that brightness she hears the shape of a sentence. Another child is unlikely, another chance, slimmer still. The baby is wrapped, weighed, and learned. Nurses map his cries. Jasper measures him with his hands. The priest knows his name so well, he mutters it while counting other things. Margaret studies stillness. She discovers how to leave her body at rest and send her thoughts where the air's thinner. Prayer becomes a road that doesn't jar the ribs. Holy Mother, let my loss purchase his safety. If I must break to make him a path, remember the bargain when men forget. Recovery settles into its quiet industry. Linen is scoured, stitches bite, then loosen. Pain redraws its borders and sulks behind them. The cross at her throat is cold most mornings, warm by vespers. When she sits, she does it with the careful authority of a veteran making terms with a wound that will never stop speaking. A door in her life has shut with a sound only she heard. She refuses to weigh her worth by that door. Beyond the chamber, weather gathers names. Warwick leans, council's list, proclamations shed their skins. Chroniclers will make a neat sequence. From a sickbed, history comes like drafts under a door, cold, uneven, insistent. Jasper circles the keep in measured steps and returns with inventories of steadiness. Sacks of grain, heads to muster, neighbors who can be trusted to stay bought. Safety, like bread, must be made daily. A letter begins to repeat a name. Henry Stafford, not a romance, a roof. A computation of acres and loyalties, a firm hand on a wheel eager to skid on ice. Margaret listens while others speak and places her fingers on the pawns, feeling nicked crowns and smoothed shoulders. She does not resent the math. She insists on doing it. The marriage is concluded with courtesy and precision. Stafford's eyes remember accounts. He speaks without trespass. He occupies space as if it belongs to him, but never cruelly. They agree like two rivers meeting. Each admits how far it has run alone. Affection may arrive. It is not required for function. Lord, let this shelter hold. I will build the devotions. He will build the walls. Count both as service, she writes, her script steadier, taller. Piety deepens not as retreat, but for vocabulary. Humility without humiliation, obedience without surrender, sacrifice without waste. She fasts lightly, keeps the hours, reads books that don't ask her to forget rooms and knives. She rarely speaks of the wound. When the cross knocks once at her breastbone, she treats it as a bell. Snow thins, and so does the illusion of quiet. Letters arrive with ink still damp. The white rose hardens its smile. The red summons lawyers and steel. Jasper's messages sharpen. The board Stafford steadies trembles in other hands. A rider leaves news at the gate without dismounting. Margaret folds the letter, squares its edges, and feels the old bead rhythm start in her palm. She has a roof, a rule, a vow that keeps her spine straight. Outside, the roses unsheathe again. What will this storm demand of a mother finished with childhood? And which piece will the game require her to move next? The weather changes with a name. Towton, snow and steel. A Palm Sunday slaughter that tilts the board and leaves Edward of York on the throne. Chroniclers will call it decisive. In Margaret's body, it feels like pressure dropping before a storm you cannot outrun. Pembroke is tested, then taken. Jasper rides into mist. The child is prized from her arms with the politeness of law. Henry goes not to a cradle but to custody. Raglan's honeyed stone, the ward of William Herbert, York's new earl. The letters that explain this are written by men who have practiced sympathy the way they practice script. Margaret reads them as one reads a diagnosis already true when spoken. She holds the cross at her throat and counts not hours but plans. Lord, if I cannot be his roof, make me his road. If I cannot warm him, then show me where to send the fire. She studies the grammar of survival. Courtesies are observed. Loyalties are phrased conditionally. Favors are banked like winter grain. With Stafford, she builds a temperate country within four walls. Steadied rents, unremarkable obedience. Nothing for York to trip over. Beyond the walls, she begins to spin lines through air. The slow geometry of trust. A steward with cousins near court. A merchant whose ledger travels further than he does. A canon who hears confessions too carefully to be random. Names are threaded, knotted, tested. Years crumple and unfold. Warwick rebels and is forgiven and rebels again. A king is deposed and restored, like furniture, moved to a different wall. Margaret learns to speak in two tenses at once. What is and what will be required if what is ends. She writes to Raglan when permitted. She writes around Raglan when she must. She learns the weight of words that can pass a chamberlain's eye without waking his suspicion. She learns to let some lines go slack so others can hold. Ave Maria, keep him from becoming what the house requires of him. Let him remember who named him. 1471 breaks like a series of waves you cannot finish swallowing. Barnet chews the spring into pieces. Stafford rides and does not return whole. Within weeks, he is a widow's name inside her mouth. Tewkesbury follows, then the Tower, where Henry VI's last breath unthreads a dynasty and tightens another. Jasper reappears like an answer to a question she had not dared to ask out loud, gathers the boy at last, and vanishes toward a coast sharpened by gulls. Ships take them to Brittany, and the distance becomes a number no prayer can reduce. Years. Margaret does what winter demands. She measures men's weights. Waiting is not idleness, it is a craft. The network thickens. Abbots who trade in news, scribes who can bend a date without breaking it, ladies who remember more than they pretend to. Coins move, favors mature. The chessboard, which once felt like a punishment, begins to feel like a language. Grief educates piety into purpose. She keeps the hours not as retreat, but as scaffolding. The cross at her throat is less an ornament than a tool, something to hold when speaking slowly to men who believe they invented patience. Out of loss, she fashions a rule. Usefulness is safer than virtue, but both together are a key. When courtiers begin to speak more often of Thomas Stanley, the king's chamberlain with a county's worth of followers and a talent for breathing with both roses, Margaret hears in the name a hinge. Widowed, prudent, watched, and underestimated, she considers the lever a single marriage could be. Mother of mercy, if this be a bargain, let it be a just one. If I must spend myself, let it purchase more than safety. A messenger rides. The seal breaks with that brittle sigh history favors. Somewhere offshore, a boy across the years is learning tides and exile. In England, a woman sets her hand to a new piece on the board and asks not whether it is permitted, but how far it can move when the hour finally comes. The name arrives with weight, not glamour. Thomas Stanley, Chamberlain, Lancashire power, stitched from dozens of lesser men who will ride when his hand lifts and wait when it lowers. A man who can hold his breath between roses without turning blue. Margaret tastes the name the way one tests iron, steady, serviceable, unlikely to shatter. They meet in rooms designed to discourage error. Stanley's gaze is a ledger. Entries neat, margins narrow, nothing ornamental. He speaks like a man who has seen kings rise and fall and prefers floors that don't tilt. Margaret listens, bead by bead, the cross cool in her palm. The bargain is stated in courtesies, but both of them read the gloss beneath. He offers reach and a shield. She offers purpose sharpened to a point. Together, they can be a hinge. The marriage is made with a precision that feels like carpentry. Settlements are drawn, her estates guarded from absorption, her household kept distinct. A small republic inside a larger country. Affection is not presumed, respect is. Stanley does not ask her to grow smaller. He asks her to be exact. This too is a shelter. Lord, let this be a tool and not a trap. If I must be bound, let it be to a work that frees someone. Proximity becomes architecture. With Stanley's keys, corridors open, chambers, chapels, the soft underbelly of court, where news is born before it learns to walk. Margaret builds a lattice that looks like piety and housekeeping, alms lists that map loyalties, kitchen inventories that overhear procurement gossip, prayer exchanges that braid abbots to aldermen. A goldsmith's apprentice carries messages inside talc for polishing. A scribe bends dates by a day to make departures invisible. Her handwriting grows plainer, so it will be less remarked. Omniscient would say, the realm steadies beneath Edward IV, as if breath might be held forever. In truth, men simply learn to whisper with their teeth closed. Warwick is gone. The Lancastrian sun has set. But night is not only darkness. Night is also preparation. Margaret's letters to Brittany thicken with absence, spaces that say what ink cannot. Henry grows from rumor into possibility. The board shifts in small ways first. A counselor coughs blood into a cloth. A shipment of cloth of gold is canceled without explanation. Accounts are paid early, which is never economy and always fear. Margaret watches the weather taught to her in girlhood, the ring turning on a thumb, the quill hovering, return like old birds to an old roof. Holy Mother, keep me from impatience. When the hour knocks, let me be already at the door. 14A3 comes like a stare you miss in the dark. Edward IV dies and silence falls the way it does after crockery shatters. Too clean, too sudden. Gloucester moves with the courtesy of a blade wrapped in silk. The princes go to the Tower the way all dangerous hope goes, quietly with good manners. Morton's name begins to travel in the same sentence with Margaret's, as if the air itself is making introductions. Stanley smiles with the kind of care that keeps his teeth secret. She inventories not armies, but angles. Which sheriffs can be made late? Which ports can be made unhelpful? Which heralds will carry a proclamation slowly if paid in candles and wheat? A map spreads on her table, the road from Milford Haven to the Midlands, traced in thread so thin it is almost hair. She thinks of the child in Brittany learning tides, and of the bells in English chapels learning when to ring. Stanley is a lever. Levers require fulcrums. Richard provides one without meaning to. In the hush that follows a summer of processions, the kingdom waits, breath held. Margaret's cross taps once at her breastbone like a knock from inside. If the board is to turn, it will turn on a husband who refuses to hurry and a mother who refuses to sleep. Which will move first, the man whose strength is delay, or the woman whose patience has teeth? Defeat does not arrive all at once. It accumulates like snow along a wall until the door won't open. Barnet buckles the spring. Tewkesbury closes it. The red rose thins to a memory. And in London, a king with a white badge writes history in a hand that leaves no smudges. Omniscient would say, the House of Lancaster is finished. Margaret refuses the tense of finished. She learns the grammar of distance. At Tenby, the tide is iron-colored, gulls wheeling like torn parchment. Jasper's hand is on Henry's shoulder, steady, unbending. The boy is 15 and looks older when he doesn't breathe. The boat is too small for a future and exactly the right size for escape. Margaret is not there to watch it push out. Her prayer finds it anyway, a taut thread between shore and hull. My son, if the sea must keep you, let it keep you alive. If you must be hidden, let your name ripen in the dark and not rot. Brittany receives them like a deep drawer pulled out of sight. Duke Francis offers shelter that changes shape depending on the weather in England. Rooms near Vaughan, then inland, then nearer the coast when London purrs that it only wants a conversation. Henry's days are an education in surviving as a noun, ward, guest, pawn. He learns the courtesy of patience. He learns to read men whose goodwill can be bought by England and returned for profit. Jasper teaches him maps, where a levee can be raised, where a road vanishes into forests with unhelpful memories, where a harbor can close its mouth in a storm and open for a friend. News crosses the channel in two moods. There are seasons when Edward IV's envoys arrive with smiles tight as purse strings, promises of pardon that sound like rope. A minister mutters numbers and thinks of rewards. A clerk copies names onto lists no one will admit exist. Warnings reach Henry the way fish reach a net, sudden and tugging. A groom who talks too softly. A window not latched, an invitation that smells of ink and trap. More than once he moves by night, sanctuary to sanctuary, the law of hospitality at his back, like an armed saint. "Jesu, if I cannot be his roof, let me be his road," Margaret writes in a plain, ungilded hand to a canon who understands how devotion can hide logistics. "If I cannot hold him, teach me whom to pay to keep those who would." Years begin to ring like hours, one much like the next unless you listen for the small variations. Henry grows edges and judgment. He practices command the way monks practice chant. He learns when silence outranks speech. On certain feast days, he allows himself to be Welsh in public, just enough red dragon to remind the heir it will need to make room for him someday. 1483 breaks the drawer open. Edward IV dies. Gloucester becomes a blade with a crown. In England, Margaret threads Morton and Stanley into a net that does not look like a net. From Brittany, Henry aims at Devon with Weather for an ally, and finds that Weather is loyal to no man. He is blown back hard, salt dried white on the letters that eventually carry the news to her. She reads the whiteness as much as the ink. Then France, where a boy king's council sees profit in a claimant with exile's discipline. Men count, ships count, promises count most when they are written by people who expect to win. Margaret's lattice in England tightens. Stanley becomes less a question than a condition. Roads are weighed like coin. Across 14 years, the tide has taught Henry how to wait without rusting. Across the same years, the chessboard has taught Margaret how to move without being seen. Storm lines stitch themselves on both sides of the channel. When the sea gives him back at last, it will not be a boy returning, but a weather system, one that knows exactly which shore to break upon. The only uncertainty that remains is the most dangerous kind. Who in England will step aside, and who will pretend to until the last possible breath? The bargain is struck with the patience of carpenters, not romance, not rescue. Architecture. Thomas Stanley brings a county's worth of writers and the quiet obedience of the Northwest. Margaret brings purpose honed to a point and estates she refuses to see absorbed. Settlements are written with margins wide enough to hide a plan. Two households are kept distinct like parallel walls bracing the same roof. Stanley watches the world the way a reeve watches weather, measuring, not marveling. He has the gift of breathing between roses without choking. He does not demand that she grow smaller. He asks only that she be exact. Margaret answers with the one dowry no clerk can tally, a mind that has learned to hear history before it speaks. "Lord, let this yoke pull a common plow. If I must be bound again, bind me to work that tills the ground for his return." With Stanley's keys, corridors lengthen. Chapels, chambers, buttery doors where gossip rises with steam. The soft machinery of court, ushers, clerks, grooms, whirs just loudly enough to be mapped. Margaret builds a lattice that looks like piety and housekeeping. Alms lists that double as loyalty ledgers, kitchen accounts that overhear shortages before proclamations confess them, household devotions that braid abbots to aldermen, a goldsmith's apprentice in the Chepe powders messages inside talc, a mercer's factor sends prices that spike a day before the king's ships sail, a canon at St. Paul's writes her sermon notes in a hand that is really ciphers and saints' days. North and west, the Stanley web tightens without appearing to move. Stewards in Lancashire calculate musters with their eyes, not on paper. Beacon hills are counted, then forgotten, then counted again. Woolmen at Chester and Skippers out of the Dee bring weather that is half wind, half rumor. Which harbor is quietly unfriendly to Yorkshire badges? Which sheriff nods late on purpose? Along the Welsh coast, two fishermen who pray loudly on market days have begun to watch for a certain pattern of sails. Omniscient would say, under Edward IV, the realm steadies as if a held breath could be permanent. Margaret hears a different music, coughs behind heiress, accounts paid early, heralds riding with their spurs wrapped to keep bells from telling tales. Her letters to Brittany thicken with what they do not say. Milk and lemon juice draw maps that only fire can read. Saints' names stand in for towns where men with red dragons still remember their grandfather's oaths. Stanley is careful enough to survive and bold enough to be useful, if levered. She studies the fulcrums that could force him: money, kinship, the long patience of a man who prefers to win by not moving until the ground moves first. She does not mistake prudence for absence of edge. She learns the rhythm of his delays and the price of his accelerations. Holy Mother, keep my hand from haste. When the hour knocks, let those who move slowly find they have been walking toward me all along. Sometimes her news outruns the king's captains. A convoy turns back at Calais before a warrant is drafted. A sheriff mislays a commission the morning a monastery flags a stranger with Breton salt on his boots. Morton, the bishop with a memory like a millstone, begins to appear in her margins more often. Nets are knotted in air. Then a tremor felt before named. The court sends for more black cloth. Physicians are fetched at hours that anger the sun. Edward IV dies, and silence becomes a street. Gloucester's courtesies lengthen like shadows. The princes pass into stone. Stanley smiles the kind of smile that keeps his teeth to himself. Margaret lays a thread from Milford Haven to the Midlands and presses her cross to her breastbone until it knocks once in answer. A lever is nothing without weight to move, and a world willing to tilt. The board quivers. Which banner, when lifted, will cost less today, and everything tomorrow? Death enters quietly. Physicians at hours that anger the sun. Black cloth bought in cartloads. Courtiers who stop finishing their sentences. Edward IV is gone. Silence becomes a street. In that hush, Gloucester moves, courteous as a blade wrapped in silk. The princes go to the tower as dangerous hope always does, politely. Soon there is only rumor, then less than rumor, then a hole in the air where boys used to breathe. Richard takes the crown. And even loyal mouths form the word with caution. Margaret reads the moment with the instruments she trusts. The turn of a ring on a thumb, the hover of a quill, the price of wool. A kingdom holding its breath is a kingdom willing to listen. She lays her rosary in a straight line across a map and sees a road form under the beads. Milford Haven to the Midlands, a thread braided to weather and timing. The cross at her breast knocks once like a summons. Mother of mercy, let justice find a language that soldiers understand. If I must be a hinge, then turn the door. Morton's memory, long and exact, becomes a loom. From hiding, and from the edges of other men's confidence, he weaves sanctuary whispers with Elizabeth Woodville, letters that walk in borrowed shoes. A promise bright enough to tempt both roses into the same vase. Henry will wed Elizabeth of York. Margaret writes with ink that fades to milk and reappears by flame. Abbots become couriers, mercers become weather vanes. The plan is not a line but a cord. Risings in Kent and the West. Buckingham's muscles flexed toward treason. Henry's sails set in Brittany, time to catch a kingdom mid-inhale. Omniscient would say, the coordination was elegant. Life insists on weather. Autumn scours the channel, ships stagger. Harbors refuse mouths to strangers. Henry aims at Devon and is shoved backward by an ocean that does not care about prophecy. On English roads, the rebellion stutters. Too early here, too late there. A bridge washed out, a sheriff unexpectedly competent. Buckingham's courage proves allergic to cold and consequence. His head parts from his counsel in the wet of November. Good plans rot fast in rain. Margaret pays in smaller coins that do not jingle. Richard's men notice what they were meant to notice. Letters, favors, the smell of a net. Her lands are eyed like bread, sentences spoken with the pity of a jailer. Stanley moves exactly as far as self-preservation allows, and then a finger's breadth more. He takes her into his keeping, a phrase that can mean cage or cover. Richard believes in levers, too. He thinks he has found one. She keeps hours in rooms that listen. Waiting is not idleness. It is a craft. Messages still move, slower, thicker, under wool and inside talc. Morton's loom does not break. It only changes thread. Elizabeth Woodville, narrowed by loss to a single sharp intention, holds her end of the bargain in a sanctuary that smells of stone and smoke. The promise of a marriage grows teeth, not romance, arithmetic. Jesu, Keep his courage from becoming impatience. Keep mine from becoming stone. Winter gnaws its way through to spring. The Channel remembers how to be a road. France, suddenly pious toward opportunity, counts ships with her. Margaret smooths a map so often the vellum warms under her palms. The chessboard that once punished her now answers in her language. Somewhere west, a boy seasoned into weather studies tides. In England, a woman watched and underestimated adjusts a single piece and waits for the board to tilt. The princes have vanished into legend, and a crown sits on a head that cannot sleep. When the wind finally turns, will England exhale toward Milford Haven, or hold its breath until men drown? Milford Haven receives him like a long-remembered syllable spoken true. The tide shoulders Henry's ships beneath a pewter Welsh sky. Salt spray freckles the letters that have wandered years to guide him home. On the beach, men tilt their faces into weather they can finally call purpose. Old rhythms wake, march, muster, oath, familiar music set to a different refrain. A chronicle might write, "A claimant lands." Margaret feels it another way. The cross at her throat taps once, then again, a pulse returning after a long faint. Eastward, the road runs under banners that remember dragons. Recruits count themselves quietly as they fall in. Rhys ap Thomas with the weight of Wales, prudent gentry whose neutrality is starting to crack. At each ford, Henry has learned to see both banks. At each town, he makes patience look like rule. Rumors run ahead like skates on ice. Mills murmur, inns smell of ink and horse. In London, a crown keeps a sleepless temple. In the marches, a mother prays with the steadiness of weather. Holy Mother, lay your hand where once mine rested. If steel must choose, let it choose the boy I gave the sea. Richard draws up where Bosworth's low hills hover like held breath. Standards go up. The white boar shines. Sunlight catches edges. Stanley comes late, as survivors do. At a distance, neither obedient nor defiant. His lines fit the field's geometry. His banner hangs like a sentence, waiting for its verb. Kept to safety in his house, Margaret reads the loudest news in what does not arrive. The lever is set. The fulcrum is a crown too proud to think itself movable. Dawn wires the grass. Henry dresses his ranks, smaller than a king, exactly a center of gravity. The first impacts are the old quarrel of ash and bone. Arrows scratch brief scripture in the air. Richard measures and commits, drives hard at the one body whose fall would finish the day. White boar cleaves toward red dragon. For a breath, the battlefield narrows to two sets of lungs. Stanley watches. He is practiced, a life of letting others declare themselves before he must. But some hours expose delay as betrayal, and the ground refuses to stay still for a man balanced on it. William Stanley moves first, a column that answers like a blade, striking the angle Richard must pass. The hinge turns. Apparent neutrality becomes motion. Margaret does not witness the stroke that ends Richard. She hears how sound changes when certainty dies. Later, the chroniclers will secure it. Crown lost, found, banner down, a cry fit for stage and history. Men discover how loyalty splinters and rolls downhill. Henry still stands, and more crucial, still advances to the place where kings usually stop. Silence takes its time and then arrives, a flattening like snow without cold. The boar is carcass. The dragon breathes. A circlet finds a head that 5 years earlier fit exile better than rule. God save King Henry is less prayer than decision. In the chapel worn by her hours, Margaret hears bells she did not pull. The cross no longer knocks. It has become bone. Servants hurry, letters fly, language searches for power that isn't queen, Mater Regis, fortress and reprieve. She lies awake counting victories as once she counted beads. The line holds. The realm is stitched. The board shows the pattern she learned to fear and wield. Somewhere a dead king rusts. Somewhere a living one studies throne silence. And she, who bargained childhood for a dynasty, listens for a price still composing its name. When it speaks, will the crown listen back? Bells plait the air until even the walls seem to listen. A crown settles where fingers will not easily pry it loose. Courtiers learn new habits, how to bow to a man apprenticed by exile, how to ink Henry by the grace of God, as if grace were a pigment that never fades. A chronicle would declare, "The Tudors are founded." Margaret measures it differently. The cross at her breast taps once, then goes quiet, not because the tale is finished, but because the debt has been paid. Marriage becomes a bridge disguised as a vow. Elizabeth of York stands at Henry's side with the calm of one fluent in both mercy and arithmetic. Red stitched to white, thorn to thorn, roses trained to share a single stem. In glass and wax, the petals learn fresh heraldry. In streets, men practice a peace that begins with keeping knives asleep. The realm exhales in cautious lungs, relearning how to warm air without coughing. Margaret moves through this grammar without haste. My Lady the King's mother walks like armor, protecting, weighty. She learns which doors swing, which rooms do not require doors at all. Councils notice how often conclusions arrive after her silence. Priors and scholars learn that her alms come with architecture, bread first, then books, then scaffolds, by which a country teaches itself to be less cruel. She funds, founds, repairs. She accounts for souls and roofs in the same ledger, because both leak if left alone. Holy Mother, keep me from mistaking quiet for completion. Teach me to spend what victory stores. The chessboard remains in the solar, not hidden, not holy, a tool that remembers every touch. She studies without moving a piece. Pawns are still pawns beneath a friendly sky. Bishops keep their diagonal courtesies that pass for kindness, and sometimes aren't. If the board has a virtue, it is clarity, not justice. A pawn that reaches the far rank may become a queen. A queen cannot walk backward into childhood. Winters arrive that are merely winters. Snow laces the leads and vanishes without omen. Banners fade from use, not blood. Children learn letters who once learned pikes. Markets count fewer widows. Some years, even the leeches rest. Peace is a workshop, not a miracle, smelling of wool, wet boots, ink, and duty. Yet the body keeps minutes while the kingdom keeps years. Margaret walks with the exactness of one who remembers forced doors and bones that healed on a slant. She loves her son in history's dialect, ceremony and council, the slow luxury of no longer counting the days between letters. They speak less of exile and more of building, knowing a nation is only as certain as its hungry month. A neat ledger would close here, Tudors secure, roses reconciled, a mother's design redeemed by a steadied land. Margaret mistrusts neat ledgers. She trusts aftertaste. Triumph sweetens and salts. When she kneels, the cross warms quickly. When she rises, rooms recall bells from a winter long ago. If victory needs a shrine, let it be a school or a hospice, not a statue. She writes in a hand that has outlived ornament. At windows, she studies weather that is only weather and feels gratitude without relief. The board rests. The garden's roses mind their own counsel. England is a house with repaired beams. Its story mortared with breath and bone no chronicle can fully price. What, at last, does a crown repay to the bodies that carried it? And who is permitted to send the bill?